Now, when you think about it, the drive to find some sort of meaning and purpose to life is deep-seated in the human psyche. In fact, going back to 1932 in his famous speech entitled My Credo, Albert Einstein put it this way. He said, "Our situation on Earth seems strange. Every one of us appears here involuntary and uninvited for a short stay, without knowing the whys and the wherefores." Well, the actress Jessica Lange felt pretty much the same. She said, "The main thing that I sensed back in my childhood was the inescapable yearning that I could never satisfy. Even now, at times, I experience an inescapable loneliness and isolation." Now, this gut feeling, this sort of instinct that we have, that we're some things and not nothings, that we're made for something or someone more, drives us invariably to ask the M question, meaning. Is there a meaning to life in general? And more specifically, is there a meaning for my life in particular? Now, according to the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who himself was a survivor of Auschwitz, the will to find meaning is the primary motivating force in man. The literary critic George Steiner says even more simply, "More than Homo sapiens, we are Homo quaerens," that is, the animal that asks and asks and asks. Somehow we can't help it. Sometimes we try to avoid it, perhaps we distract ourselves. But the question keeps returning to haunt us. Maybe in the small hours of the morning when we can't sleep. Perhaps when a relationship which we valued so much has ended, and perhaps ended tragically. And certainly when we're facing death, when we feel bereavement. That's when we ask that question, what's it all about? But the first question, of course, is what do we mean by meaning? Well, to speak of finding meaning to life is the idea that of having a view of life and the world which enables us for people to make sense of life and have security in the world. So we're talking about having sense, having security. And throughout the ages, different pictures have been used to get this idea across. So Plato spoke of it as like having a raft which enables us to sail through life's troubles. In the 20th century, it was the famous scientist Aldous Huxley who likened it to a cave, whereby we carve out of the darkness of this world a cave of our own meaning. Or we may think of it as having a map, like a road map, which enables us to navigate our way through life without hurting ourselves, without hurting others, but to do so with a sense of direction, a sense of significance, and a sense of purpose. Now, tonight, I want to introduce you to someone who pursued this question with almost supernatural vigor. He was a king. He was a scholar. He was a writer. He was a musician. And if he were around today, he would be described as a scientist. Now, in fact, this person doesn't have a name, but he does have a title. He's simply called the teacher, in Hebrew, Koheleth. And the word Koheleth means a gatherer. So whether it's the idea that this was a man who gathered knowledge from the four corners of the earth and tried to piece it together, or that he gathered people around him in order to teach them, or perhaps both. And what he wrote, his thesis, if you like, we find in the Bible, and it goes by the name Ecclesiastes, again, the gatherer or the teacher. Now, he begins his thesis by asking a realistic question. What does man gain from all his labors under the sun? Quite literally, what profit is there in life? Or as we may say today, what is the bottom line? Is it possible to know true meaning and value in this life and be satisfied with it? If so, how? If not, then, well, what is the point of living? One person who asked this very same question was the author of War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy. My question, he said, the one that brought me to the point of suicide when I was 50 years old, was a most simple one, and one that lies in the soul of every person, from a silly child to a wise old man. It's the question without which life is impossible, as I had to learn it from experience. And it is this: what will come of what I do today or tomorrow? What will come of my entire life? Expressed another way, the question can be put like this: why do I live? Why do I wish for anything or do anything? Or, expressed another way, is there any meaning in my life that will not be annihilated by the inevitability of death which awaits me? Now, that's what Tolstoy said. And in his own ways, he was simply asking the very same question as the teacher in Ecclesiastes, a realistic question. But quite early on in his thesis, the teacher considers what he thinks to be a realistic assessment. And in the second verse of his thesis, he simply says this: meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Now, at this point, I was tempted to just sit down and say, well, there you are, short talk, wasn't it? But what does man gain, he asks, from all his labors under which he toils under the sun? Now, when you look at this is the opening of his thesis. It really seems to put the mockers on things. But you've got to give it to the guy. He's honest, and he's hard-nosed. He doesn't duck any of the difficult questions. But what does he mean? Was he simply ahead of the game? Ahead of many of the artists and the thinkers of the 20th century, which came to the very same conclusion that life is totally empty, void, meaningless, like, say, the playwright Samuel Beckett? Well, here's his play entitled Breath. Well, there you are in Hull. You want your £20 back, wouldn't you, if you went to see that? But that was the play, okay? It was a 35-second play. He actually wrote that play on the back of a postcard, and he sent it to New York in 1969. And it was actually incorporated in an erotic review. It consists of a silence, a cry, an inhalation, silence, an exhalation, a cry, and silence. And on the stage, you just simply have, right in the middle, a pile of rubbish, stuff. You don't see anyone, you only have noise. And that, to Beckett, seemed to sum up everything. He was an atheist. You begin with silence. There is no meaning in the universe. This is a silent universe. There's no God. And then there's the cry. You're born into the world. Hence the inhalation, the cry of a baby. And then the light gets brighter for just a short moment to reveal that all you're surrounded with is stuff, which amounts to little more than rubbish. Then there's the exhalation, the cry of the death rattle, followed by silence and darkness. That's it. The Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who began life an atheist and a Marxist, underscored how right Beckett was in following through his atheism. He said the absence of God, when consistently upheld and thoroughly examined, spells the ruin of man in the sense that it demolishes or robs of meaning everything we have been used to think of as the essence of being human. The quest for truth, the distinction between good and evil, the claim to dignity, the claim in creating something which will withstand the indifferent destructiveness of time. But is that what the teacher is actually saying? Well, he's not saying that at all. It's something slightly different. He's reflecting on what life feels like, as he puts it, under the sun. That is, what does it feel like in day-to-day experience? And he uses a very interesting word, which in our modern Bibles is translated meaningless. In the King James Version, the Authorized Version, is translated vanity. Vanity, all is vanity. But it could equally be translated mist or smoke. Or my favorite is this. Bubbles. That's the word. Hevel. And it's a trick, of course, which children fall for time and time again. We do it with our grandchildren. Let's think what grandparents we've got. But you blow some bubbles. And you say, go ahead and chase them, and so they do. And in trusting innocence, they run out, and for a moment, they reach out their little hand to catch a bubble, and as soon as they do, pop, it's gone. Well, that's hevel, meaningless. And so much of life feels like that. It's elusive. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. It looks pretty, it looks beautiful and attractive, you want to catch it, but the moment you think you've got it, then it's gone. It disappears. And what is more, the whole of life can seem like that. A chasing after bubbles, or sometimes the writer talks about chasing after the wind. So what sort of things form the bottom line in life? What does it profit a human being? What are we to live for? In the sense of giving life a sense of purpose. Well, let me just mention to you just a few of the things that the teacher tried out and which many are pursuing today. The first one is pleasure. He says, I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless bubbles. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself up with wine and embracing folly, having a good laugh. My mind was still guided by wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during their few days of their lives. Now today, this would be seen in the ever-popular route of consumerism. Whatever will make us feel good, we purchase, or even, in fact, the act of purchasing, shopping is good. The mentality of, you shop until you drop. Someone said it's Tesco ergo sum rather than cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am. Tesco ergo sum. I shop therefore I am. That's where you find meaning. And somehow we feel we've got to inject into our lives the high-octane fuel of enjoyment, which will produce the necessary release of serotonin in our brain and give us that lift, will help us to deal with what is otherwise a mundane, humdrum existence. But while having pleasure and enjoyment are good things, they can never become the thing. that which actually motivates you and gets you out of bed in the morning. It can never be the thing which will enable you to produce meaningful, productive lives. And if you think about it, you can see why. To begin with, pleasure can never be sought in and of itself. Pleasure is always a byproduct of something else. So, for instance, you gain a profound sense of delight in having a conversation with a friend. And it's rich. And you don't realize you've been talking for 3 hours when in fact it only seems like 3 minutes. The activity of a conversation, of friends, and the pleasure gained, well, that's the byproduct. And so you could go on and think of other pleasures, such as reading, or listening to music, or going to the theater, or the cinema, or sex. These are all activities which can produce pleasure. But you try and base your life solely on pleasure-seeking, being the hedonist, well, that is chasing after the bubbles. Pleasure. But then there are projects. Work. Again, the writer has done this. He says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone who had ever lived in Jerusalem before me. Now, this is a man who really went out to grab the world by the throat. His conclusion? Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. Chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Now, why does this work, projects, feel like chasing after the wind? Well, first of all, because it leads to anxiety. All his days is not rest. This too is meaningless, says the teacher. Now, here's a very candid admission from the late actor John Thor, who was, as many of you know, was TV's Inspector Morse, amongst other things. And he said this, I suppose I'm a workaholic. It's all about needing to work to give yourself some importance, to prove that you exist. If I have a month or two off with nothing to do, I get very fidgety, nervous, edgy. It isn't insecurity because I know there's work coming up. It must be, I suppose, that I need work so as to be able to say to people, look, I'm here, I exist. Similar sentiment was expressed by Madonna. My drive in life comes from a fear of being mediocre. That is always pushing me. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being. But then I feel as if I'm still mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. But even though I have become somebody, I still have to prove that I am somebody. My struggle never ends. And I guess, she says, it never will. Anxiety. Now, of course, what gives anxiety a particular edge and potency is the expectation of death. The writer says, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man. The living should take that to heart. Now, it is the prospect of death which takes us to the heart of the tragedy of the human condition. Death casts its long shadow over everything. How are we going to spend the comparatively little time we have here in this world? Will there be enough time to fulfill our purpose? Will we ever find it? It was the German existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger who believed that anyone honest about the human condition couldn't help suffer from what he called a constitutional anxiety. The term he used to describe human beings was that we are being towards death. We're always moving towards it. We're always aware that it's there. The 20th century theologian Paul Tillich described the 20th century as the age of anxiety, of meaninglessness. And as you get older, you get more anxious. And why do you get more anxious? Because you jolly well know that there's less time ahead of you than behind you. Now, part of the absurdity of living in the face of death is that you may not live to enjoy the benefits of what you've really worked hard for. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, says the teacher, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Now, has it not been the experience of many of the rich and famous, the talented, the gifted, who have offspring who, to be honest, couldn't hold a candle up against their parents? And they take all that they have and they squander it and throw it all away. Now, someone we may have thought would have gained some sort of satisfaction from his achievements was the man who invented dynamite, Alfred Nobel. And yet here is how he describes himself. Alfred Nobel, pitiful creature, ought to have been suffocated by a humane physician when he made his howling entrance into this life. Important events in this life, none. And then nearer death, he wrote, "How pitiful to strive to become someone or something in the motley crowd of 1.4 billion two-legged tailless apes whining around in our revolving earth projectile." Well, he would have been a bellyful of lass and you would want him at your party, wouldn't you? But when you think about it, what is he doing? Well, he's echoing the thoughts of Beckett and many of the thinkers of the 20th century. So we looked at pleasure, we've looked at projects. What about popularity? Perhaps making it to the top. Being popular, being famous may do the trick. Well, this fellow tried it as well. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to take warning. The youth may have come up from prison to the kingship, or may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Now he's describing there a rags to riches story, the climb from prison to palace. But once you reach the top, then there's nowhere else to go but down. And then you've got more anxiety, you see. So is that what life is all about? You get the good qualification so that you can get the good job with a good salary, so you can buy the big house with a big mortgage, and then you can get the big car, and following on from that, you can get the big ulcer. You see, for all the fame and for all the glamour, often there's a dark side, there's a shadow side to it all. We may think, for example, of the international comic actor Peter Sellers. He lived a very lucrative life, and he made those side-splitting Pink Panther movies. If you've not seen any, you've not lived. I mean, they're brilliant. He was a genius, a very tormented genius, though. He lived a glamorous life. He spent money as if there was no tomorrow. But he also lived a tormented life and a very selfish life. His friend and fellow goon, Spike Milligan, said this of him: to try to know him was like going to a desert island. He's that lonely. He's desperate to be happy, successful, wanted, happily married. He's desperate not to destroy his past. It's all desperation. He is desperation. And you know what? He died a very lonely and tragic figure at the age of 54. He was estranged from his 2 children, whom he cut out of his will, and yet surprisingly, they still loved him to bits. So if pleasure, projects, and popularity all prove to be dead ends in giving meaning to life, then what are we left with? Well, some would say, come on, let's face it, there's nothing. We've just got to make do. In fact, what we've got to do is to create our own fake meaning. And this is really what the American comedian and film director Woody Allen opted for. He says the universe is indifferent. So we create a fake world for ourselves. And of course, Hollywood is all about creating fake worlds, isn't it? And we exist within the fake world, a world that, in fact, means nothing at all when you step back. It's meaningless. But it's important that we create some sense of meaning, because no perceptible meaning exists for anybody. Now, what he really means is that if we did not have some sense of purpose and direction, even if we make it up, and know we have made it up, is the only thing that will keep us from falling into despair. And of course, for those of you who know this kind of thing, this was one of the big themes of the French existentialist philosophers, like Albert Camus, who said that the greatest philosophical question of all was suicide. Why do we not just commit suicide? Because life is meaningless. But the problem with fake meaning is that it has no meaning at all. It's like talking about fake love or fake money. They're just that, they're fake. And the other problem, of course, is what happens when someone's fake meaning clashes with your fake meaning, and it is brutal. So someone says, well, my fake meaning is found in exploiting the vulnerable. And we know about that, don't we, from recent events and #MeToo. But if there is no ultimate purpose, if there's no objective basis for ethics, so who is to say what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, might that not change with time and whoever happens to occupy the positions of power at the time? And so we come to a realistic response. Now, I said the teacher is a realist. He recognizes that life is really made up of the good, the bad, and the ugly. How at one moment life seems so worthwhile, especially in the face of beauty. But within a moment, within a heartbeat, it fades away into some sort of gray, empty hollowness. And you know, even contemporary films reflect some of the musings of Ecclesiastes. As one writer says, there is perhaps no better example than the 1999 Academy Award-winning movie American Beauty, which calls into question our contemporary obsession with producing beauty while simultaneously suggesting that there is another more fragile beauty that is present for those who have eyes to see it. Lester, that's the character there's voiceover at the beginning of the movie and end of the movie serves in a very similar way to the opening and the closing of the poems of Ecclesiastes, bookending what happens in between. And this is what Lester says. It is hard to stay mad when there's so much beauty in the world. I can't feel anything but gratitude for every single moment of my stupid little life. Now, you may say, well, come on, Melvin, I didn't expect to find this in the Bible. I thought there'd be some good news. You Christians always talk about good news. Well, where is it? Well, there is good news. But I put it to you, unless we realize where not to look for the answer, then we'll never go around thinking where the true answer may lie. Now, the writer has been describing everybody's experience on earth. It doesn't matter where you're from, which country, what culture, what age. This is the universal experience of humankind. As someone has said, the problem of life is that life is the problem. This is what it feels like, and there's no denying it. Life under the sun. Life bound by Earth's limited horizons. And so while we can and should enjoy things like fame, food, and fashion and fortune, what we can't do is to derive or extract ultimate meaning from them, as if that is all life is about and what it's for. No, we need something or someone from the outside to give us that. And the teacher tells us what that something, or more precise, someone is. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on man. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone should eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. In other words, to use a term of one famous sociologist, Peter Berger, we live in a universe, we live in a world where there are signals of transcendence. Something will happen to us, maybe the birth of a baby, maybe facing suffering, maybe just looking up and seeing the night sky. And then suddenly we pick up there's something more to life than what we're experiencing. There's something out there. Signals of transcendence. And the teacher says, well, where do those signals come from? They're coming from somewhere. We're picking them up. God, if you like, has put there's a transmitter and there's a receiver in our hearts. He's put eternity in our hearts, so that we may revere him, that is, get to know him. It was a very famous philosopher, Wittgenstein, who wrote, "The sense of the world must lie outside the world. That is, left by ourselves, we can no more find out the purpose of life than someone can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. What we need is for that meaning, ultimate meaning, to be revealed to us from the outside." At the funeral of his own father, the management consultant Charles Handy suddenly realized how this modest man had affected the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people in ways he could never have imagined. He then went on to say this, "I realize that what one believes about life and the point of life does matter. I had put my faith until that moment in success, money, and family, probably in that order. I still think that these things are important, although I would now reverse the order. but I hanker after a bigger frame in which to put them. Now, the teacher knows that it is God who provides the bigger frame. He's put eternity in our hearts, a sense of purpose, so that we may seek him, we may find him, and especially if he allows himself to be known. You see, our meaningfulness and the meaningfulness of the universe stems from the fact that we are created by a personal God. For only created things can have meaning. Now let me take a very simple example. Here we've got this lectern, this sort of stand. Now what meaning does this lectern have? Well, in and of itself, it has no meaning at all. The meaning it has is what its creator and owner and judge give it. So whoever made this did so with a purpose in mind. So it holds lecture notes or a music book or music and so on. So the creator gave it meaning. But once it is sold, the owner can give it meaning. You see, I could take it and I could, in theory, I guess, use it to shovel away snow. But that's not the intended meaning of the creator. It's not the purpose of the original designer. But I can do that. But of course, in doing that, it's distorting its meaning. It's distorting its purpose. It's not a proper use. It's an abuse. But one day, we can think of it like this, a judge will give it its meaning. He will evaluate it and say, this is a crummy lectern. It's rubbish, it doesn't stand up anymore, I'm going to throw it in the bin. Or maybe someone will come along and say, this is fantastic lectern, it's marvelous, it's so good, I'm going to pass it on to my son. So you have the maker of it, you have the owner of it, you have the judge of it, all give it meaning. Well, our value, our meaning, derives from our maker, who is also our owner and our judge. As the teacher says, we're meant to revere him. That is to honor him, to adore him, to love him, to respond to him properly as he has made us. Now here's the thing. The Old Testament, that's the first part of the Bible, looked forward to the coming of someone else who was going to be known as the teacher. And he too was going to be a king, a wise man. In fact, he was going to be more than a teacher, more than a king, more than a wise man. He, in fact, was God himself. The Creator becoming a creature to show us how such creatures are meant to behave and derive true meaning in life. And of course, I'm speaking about the Lord Jesus Christ. And when you read there are 4 biographies in the New Testament, the second part of the Bible called the New Testament. And when you read these through, you'll see time and time again how he delighted in his heavenly Father. He'd say, take some bread, and before enjoy eating it with some fish, he would give his thanks to God for that wonderful gift. He enjoyed the company of friends. He enjoyed telling stories. He sought to offer comfort to the sick. He even knew when his time had come to die and to go to the cross in order to deal with the root cause of all our dis-ease and our sense of feeling we have no meaning. In other words, he went to deal with the fundamental problem, which is our estrangement from the one who made us because of our rebellion. And then rising from the dead, he shows that what we do here on earth doesn't die with us. It's going to carry on into eternity because our lives are going to be judged by him and given ultimate value, either for good or for ill. Well, at the graduation address at Harvard University in 1978, Alexander Solzhenitsyn addressed his distinguished audience with these words. He said, if humanism was right, in declaring that man is born to be happy, he would not be born to die. Since his body is doomed to die, his task on earth must be of a more spiritual nature. It cannot be the unrestrained enjoyment of everyday life. It cannot be the search for the best way to obtain material goods and then cheerfully to get the most out of them. It has to be the fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty, so that one's life journey may become an experience of moral growth, so that one may leave life a better human being than when one started it. Now notice what Solzhenitsyn assumes. He assumes that this life is not the only one. Otherwise, being a better human being at the end is also futile, for you die like all the others who are not better human beings at the end. No, you see, there's got to be eternity. It's that perspective. It's that bigger frame that Hanke was longing for that God provides. Living not just under the sun, but living under heaven. The transcendent reality. And then living in heaven, which transforms this life, where God, through Jesus Christ, becomes our Father, so that even now we know Him as our Father. We live for Him and for His glory and His enjoyment and our enjoyment in Him, and for the well-being of other people. The fact is, this life is like a breath. It's like a bubble. But eternal life, which begins now with knowing God in Jesus, by whom and for whom we were made, will culminate in eternity. And that is the thing that makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.